Welcome, everyone. Welcome to this very special podcast episode with Michele Neff Hernandez. I am really excited for you to hear her and hear her story and to get a really different perspective on the kind of grief support that is out there. Michele Neff Hernandez is an international speaker and she's an author. She has a book that's coming out in February, and it's I had the honor of being able to read a galley version of that book, and it's just really touched me because I have my own experience of losing a spouse. Oddly enough, we were the same age when we lost our spouses. And oddly enough, we both remarried again to Australians. So I feel like we have a lot in common. But I want to also say that while I was reading her book, I was very aware that things that I thought I had worked through were just very present and alive for me still. So we'll hear about the book, but I just right off the top got to recommend the book. It's just really great. So anyway, let me introduce you. Oh, and I want to say one other thing. Michele Neff was one of the CNN heroes for 2021. And I actually got on the YouTube and saw the wonderful speech that she gave, and just to be in that circle of people that are just really lifting up the world and doing good. I mean, she was quite outstanding in that venue. So anyway, here is Michele. Hi,
It's so
Michele.
lovely to be here. Thank you so much, Claire, for inviting me.
Yeah, it's great to have you. You're in Simi Valley. That's by
Simi Valley, California. So for those who aren't familiar, we're down in Southern California, just a little south of Santa Barbara.
Yeah. Well, okay, so let's just very briefly, I know it's a long story and you can't really do it justice, but just let the audience know what happened in 2005 when you lost your husband, Philip. And yeah, I think they'd like to hear about how you got from there to the work that you're doing now.
Yeah, so I like to tell people a lot of our tragic stories, right? A lot of our traumas begin with the death of somebody that's pivotal in our lives. And my story begins when my 39-year-old husband, he was just a couple months away from his 40th birthday, went out for his evening bike ride and was hit from behind by a car and died a little less than an hour later. I was, at the time, I don't know that I would have described it this way, but today I can say I was fortunate to be able to have gotten a call from the side of the road. So I was able to get to him and see him. He wasn't conscious, but he was still alive. And I realized that so many people don't get that opportunity now. So I feel really grateful for having had just those few moments with him. I was 35. We had a blended family of 6. He had 3 kids and I had 3 kids. And we had been married for 5 years. So in many ways, just felt like, the beginning for us. We were just beginning to figure out how to blend a family. And we were beginning to really sort of settle into what our married life looked like. And so that minute changed everything. I went from being a 35-year-old wife to being a 35-year-old widowed. And I had literally no idea what to do with myself. And so really that, to me, that was the pivotal question. And that was, what do I do with myself now?
And you actually went around and started interviewing people who were widows, had lost spouses, to find out what to do.
Exactly right. Well, and the funny thing is, one of the things I talk about in the book is that I didn't know any other widowed people. I didn't feel like I knew anybody who was raising kids and was widowed. When I called to mind a widowed person, the only person I could think of was my grandmother and my great aunt, and both of them had been dead for quite a long time. What I didn't realize at the time was how similar that I probably would have found some comfort in their stories. I thought I needed to find somebody who had exactly the same story as I did. And so in order to, I was well supported. I had great community support. My family was amazing, but nobody knew what to do with me because none of them were widowed. And so they couldn't understand, we didn't know if what I was doing was normal, if what I was feeling was normal, if, they, of course, looking in from the outside were really worried about my future. I wasn't really worried about my future. I was worried about making it through the next 24 hours. So for them, they were looking at through a longer lens and concerned about my future. I just didn't know what to do with myself in the moment. And so it occurred to me that the only people who might have any answers to the questions that I was coming up with in my head, including what am I supposed to do with his shoes? How long do I wear this wedding ring? Which I can't imagine letting go of, and at the same time feels false. And so I didn't know who else to ask. And asking my family, they looked at me like I looked at them, which was, I don't know. Do you know? So that's what led me to really start just looking for other widowed people and saying, I came up with this list of 50 questions. They were all very practical because I wanted some practical advice. And I would go to wherever any widowed person was and ended up traveling across the United States. And literally, I never met these people. If someone said, oh, I know a widow, I'd say, do you think she would let me talk to her? And here's the thing I didn't know at the time is that the reason they said yes is because they knew that I needed them and that they wanted the opportunity to be able to have that community with me. I didn't realize at the time how powerful that was, but I was really grateful. And every single conversation, no matter how different our circumstances, and they were very different in a lot of cases, made me realize that it didn't really matter if we were the same age or if we'd had the same experience in terms of how our person died or how long we were married. It really just this life-altering experience of your person you thought you were spending your life with dying, however long you had with them, however they died, connects you in this really powerful way. And being able, it was as if we could finish each other's sentences. And that part was really incredible.
Yeah. Yeah, I've recently been kind of coming to grips with the term complicated grief and the bizarre situations that, myself, my sister, people that are grieving but aren't really allowed to grieve by society because it doesn't follow into some sort of norm. Say you've raised a son and he's a stepson and he's died, and people don't think you're supposed to grieve a stepson that you raised that died because he's not your child. But if it had been her child, everybody would have been there to support her. And that was, well, and then I think about what it must be like for the people that you've worked with that are spouses of people that have died of COVID-19. Talk about complicated. You can't be there. What is that like?
And that's the thing that I think is interesting is that every unique grief experience has its nuance, and that oftentimes we think, oh, this must be harder, or that must be harder, or I can't imagine, that, for example, a homicide or a suicide, like each one just has its own nuance. And COVID-19 does have this nuance of, I tell people it's like if someone were to say bike accident to me every day, all day long, from everything I see, signs on outside of the grocery store telling me, because of COVID-19, I need to wear a mask. And, the radio, the TV, the commercials, they cannot escape.
Get away from it.
They cannot get away from it. And that, just that alone, not setting aside all of the rituals of grief, which I tell people, it's been kind of funny because there's a long-standing joke, right, in the grief community. Oh, they brought me a lasagna, because you get so much food. But think about the COVID-19 people who got nothing. There wasn't a stream of people on the porch with the lasagna because they couldn't come to the house and be a comfort. And so these people have really grieved in isolation. They've had tragic experiences in the hospitals. because they weren't able to be with the person who they loved, who was dying. That shifted a little bit through pandemic as we've sort of learned to live with the long-term effects of this horrible thing. But they will have some unique traumas. And the other piece of it is, for me, is that some of what we live with is grief specific and some of it's trauma specific. And so when you combine the two, which in a COVID-19 experience and oftentimes in a complicated grief experience, we're combining what would be a natural grief experience with the trauma related to whatever makes this grief experience unique. And so part of the reason why I wrote my book for people who were experiencing trauma in addition to grief is because a lot of times we have a lot in common in terms of how we're processing, what we need to process, why we need to process these really strong feelings. I love that you said at the opening that you realized that there were some things that were still coming up for you, because I think that's a critical understanding of our traumatic experiences. When we can acknowledge that there is leftover trauma, that gives us the opportunity to name it, to own it, to make sure that we can provide ourselves with the supports that are necessary to be able to continue moving through. It's when we pretend it doesn't exist that we get in trouble.
Yeah. And you also have expanded the definition of widow. Tell us a little bit about that, because I think that's important too, for people that are needing support, grief support, and your website, the Soaring Spirits International. And there are just so many ways that your organization can support people in grief and bereavement who may not think they qualify because they're not a widow.
Well, I'll tell you that's the one thing that breaks my heart every time I get a message from someone who says, do I qualify? Because, you'll hear people a standard kind of comment about being widowed is, I hate the word widow. I don't want anyone to call me that. But then you've got a whole group of people who would just love to be acknowledged as widowed because that's how they feel. That's how they're living their experience. And so for us at Soaring Spirits, we use the definition, any person who has experienced the death of the person they thought they were going to spend their life with is welcome in our programs. So irregardless of any legal status in, gender, sexual orientation, whether or not you were married, some people were divorced, some people have been, separated for any number of reasons, thinking they were coming back together. This is my person. And so if your person died and you believed that you were going to spend the rest of your life with them and you feel widowed, we recognize that as a widowed experience and offer the support of our programs to help people process and access resources that will, help them grow through.
Yeah, that's great. I loved your fishbowl analogy.
I'm so glad.
No, I think that's where when I started making my list of people that were, in my life and different levels of, it was very revealing to me about who to rely upon. Rather than me describe the fishbowl exercise, do you want to tell them about the fishbowl?
Yeah, I will. What's great about the fishbowl is that it began as a workshop for one of our Camp Widow. And it was really to help people, because a lot of times when you're grieving, you struggle with people's perception of your grief. And so, you have to ask the question, like, is this person grieving? Just as a perfect example, someone who's grieving their stepson, and nobody thinks they should grieve their stepson, even though that is a very natural grief. And so then you start questioning yourself and wondering if other people's judgments, how seriously should I take the fact that they don't think I should be grieving? So the fishbowl analogy was built to help people identify how much to take into account what someone has said to you. So it's designed for feedback. It's designed for judgment, straight judgment, where someone's just judging you, but it's also for advice, so that when you get a piece of advice, rather than, and I'll share the quick personal story that developed into fishbowl, which was that after my husband's death, I sold his air conditioning and heating truck, which is a huge, tremendous thing. And I bought the car that he and I had decided we wanted to buy, which was a red Mini Cooper. He was delighted by this car. He thought it was going to be the greatest thing. He had not yet convinced me that it was a good idea before he died. But then, of course, he dies. And I think, okay, well, I should just buy the car he thought I should buy. So I buy the car. I paid cash for it because I used the cash that was from his truck. And a person who was a banking professional that had access to my information called me and asked me if I bought a car. And I was there like, what? How do you know? I didn't even have the car yet. I had purchased the car. It was still coming to me. And it just made me realize, like, wait a minute, like, it's none of your business. And I need to start being we aware of my boundaries and less. When in our early grief, oftentimes we bring it in. Everybody, we need help, we need support, we are uncertain of ourselves. So we're asking for advice, maybe from people we typically wouldn't. And so the fishbowl analogy was built to imagine that you are in a fishbowl, you live in a fishbowl. And, one thing that if you're a goldfish, you have to have someone feeding you because you cannot go out and get your own food. So who in your life are what I call fish feeders? And those are the people who, whether it's emotional, physical, logistical, they're the people who help you anytime you need something, and are the people you count on consistently. And so for sometimes that's people who live in your house. Sometimes that's not people who live in your house, but these are the people. If you needed, if you had a flat tire and you were stuck somewhere, who would you call? If you were having an emotional quandary and you were so upset, who would be the people you would call to help work that out? Those are your fish feeders. The next level is the people who also live in your fishbowl. And so, you consider these people's needs because your choices impact them too. And so they might be fish feeders. It's possible to be both. It's not always true. Sometimes if you live with, say you're in charge of children or even taking care of an aging parent, the people you live with may be more of an energy drain than an energy fill. And then there's people who live in neighboring fish bowls. And the purpose of that is to remember that comparing ourselves to other people, even other people who seem to have a very similar life circumstance, can often cause us to think that we're doing it wrong, when maybe we're doing it right for ourselves and they're doing it right for themselves, but those two things might look very different. And then there's people who are looky-loos. They're the people who stare into your bowl. And those, that was designed specifically for judgment. If people are just looking in your bowl, they're not fish feeders. They don't live with you. They're not even in a neighboring fish bowl. They're just peeking at you to see what you're up to. Then, their comments and their advice and their judgment, can be set in sort of a structure of like, okay, so that's not that important. And most people really love best is the fish who live in the ocean. And so this category of people, the idea is if they live in the ocean, you can't be putting any salt water in your fish bowl. And so those are so far out of your range that they should have no impact on you at all. And this was designed for people, how many of us have been impacted by, especially for grievers, right? We, go to work or we're in a social situation and some random person we don't know that well says, wow, you just look so sad, or, oh, guess you're not sleeping a lot, huh? You just look really tired. And then we walk away going, oh God, I look awful. And so it's like, well, what does it matter what that person said? We take it in, it doesn't. Yeah. And so they are fish that live in the ocean. Leave them out there in the ocean and don't let them impact the environment that you're building around you in your own fishbowl. And the book takes you through this in a way to help you really, it's twofold. It's first to acknowledge who are your people who support you, where is your support network, but also to understand where's your energy going. If I'm taking care of other people and I have people in my fishbowl or neighboring fish who are in need of my attention constantly, I need to just be aware that they're an energy drain and know that I need to do some extra self-care in order to be able to maintain my own healthy boundaries, emotional health, while being available to these people. And so it really just was designed to kind of give you that structure of being able to begin setting boundaries and identify who your support network really is.
So there's, and that's great for people that have, an unexpected death that happens in their life. I wish, and my husband's death was unexpected. It was a heart attack at 49. It was just completely unexpected. But I wish I had had that information almost before that happened, because one of my biggest regrets to this day, and this happened in 1985, so it was a while back, is that I was not really, I was so wrapped up in my own grief that I wasn't supporting my children the way they needed support. You know, they were in my fishbowl. Yeah. But I also, while I was reading this, I was thinking how most people will die of a slow progressive chronic disease. And the people that have an anticipated death, you know, those spouses, those families, those people need this support before the fact, you know.
Well, and really the fishbowl piece especially is for anyone. Fishbowl is applicable to any person anywhere. And it's particularly useful for people who are grieving or people who find themselves in traumatic situations, including caring for a loved one over a long period of time, which is an extended trauma and includes a variety of individual traumas as you walk the process of, you know, from diagnosis to dealing with the everyday realities that come with whatever illness you have, all the way through end of life. But, you know, what I love about Fishbowl, you know, I've done this presentation a lot of times, and typically it's for widowed people, but almost always there are other people in the room, either support people or whatever. I cannot count how many of them have come up and said, you know, that Fishbowl thing is really good. Like, I really get it, because I could use it in my life, and it is designed to be able to be used by anyone to help you, because that's the thing I think we forget sometimes, especially when we're busy caring for other people, that we are creating our own environment. And then that environment is influenced by all the things that we allow into our lives. And so when somebody at a party says, you know, you're a buzzkill because you're not that much fun, if I let that comment in, I'm now spending my energy being concerned about what a random person said to me, because we get so fixated on the negative comments that people make, whether or not they're actually true and whether or not they're actually relevant. So it's just a helpful reminder. And like you said, especially if you are in anticipatory grief, or, you know, because again, those caregivers are getting all kinds of comments, all kinds of advice. People who have cancer, I can't count how many of them have said, okay, I don't want to hear another thing about how I should eat this green thing or take this powder or do that thing, because people mean well, they really want to help, but after a while it's just overwhelming and too much information. So to be able to give them tools to answer that is really important, I think.
Yeah, and kind of the flip side of that, I really relived that 1985 experience very, very vividly. And after 3 months of just really spiraling down, you know, I had someone who I barely knew say, you know, you need to do something to snap out of this. And I think because she wasn't someone that that close to me, there was something about the distance with her that really was like, if she can see it, this is okay. You think you're carrying this all around inside. And, you know, if random person is just like, but it was almost like something came through and channeled through her that hit me in the right way.
What's so interesting about that is that when you read the section about the looky-loos, which is that set right before you get out to the ocean, you know, one of the statements is, could they possibly see something from looking outside into your fishbowl that you haven't seen? And the answer is sure, they might. Yeah. And so it's not so much, and my effort in this is especially to help people evaluate the feedback. And so for you, right, that moment from somebody who would probably be considered a looky-loo under the categories was able to see something, point it out to you, and suddenly you were like, wait a minute, that actually is something I need to pay attention to. And so it's about being able to give ourselves, I felt like in my early grief, I had opened all my personal boundaries so wide because I was so, just overcome by the tragedy of what had happened
Sure.
and no clue how I was going to make my way out, that I just kept I was doubting myself. So I was welcoming every bit of feedback. And at one point I was like, too much feedback. But then how do I sort it? And so that's really this feedback sorting technique is to help you take and with the intention of not losing the valuable feedback. Because coming back to that red car experience, as soon as that man said something to me that made me feel like my borders had been breached, I shut down and I didn't take any feedback. No, you cannot tell me what to do. I will do whatever I want. I'm doing, and what I realized eventually was like, wait, this is harder. I'm not accessing the people who do actually care about me. I'm not taking into account my people who live in my fishbowl. Then I realized, okay, I've gone too far the other way. And so fishbowl kind of helps you to find a middle ground from too much to completely independent thinking, taking into account that no one else's feedback. And that I found that to be equally dangerous, frankly.
Yeah. So there are people that really, maybe they don't have the kind of support that you give, or they just really cannot get out of this rut that they've created for themselves. When, in your opinion, do you think it's important to reach out for professional help?
I really think that when you cannot see your way out, that every amount of support that you can find is important, in particular professional support. So, one of the things about complicated grief specifically, and to just give a very, very vague, kind of vanilla-ish kind of definition of complicated grief, it's when your grief is stopping you from being able to move forward in any area of your life. And that doesn't mean immediately, in your early grief, it's so confusing and you feel like you can't go anywhere. But if that lasts for years and you're still, say, 3 years later, really truly unable, you're unable to get out of bed or you're unable to do anything for yourself, this is when it's time to start asking yourself, okay, how can I get more support? Because I'm not going to be able to hard work my way out of this. The feelings are there and they have to be processed. And sometimes we just don't have the tools to process them ourselves, or the life experience or the supportive network. So many people I've met are struggling through their grief experience literally on their own.
Yeah.
Coming back to those COVID-19 widowed people, is another thing, is that, they can't go to their therapist's office. They're going to have a Zoom meeting. And so, just that lack of human interaction can really make a difference. So what I hope for people who are struggling, and at the end of the book, one of the things that I ask people to do is just give themselves grace, because working through trauma is hard. And full stop, that's it. It's hard. And so many times we're setting these expectations for ourselves and trying to get back to who we used to be when we've been altered by we've experienced. And so allowing ourselves to be changed is really the first step to healing. So often it's that big barrier. It's like, I can't get back to my old self, so I must have failed. And redefining success and acknowledging the powerful influence that trauma has on our lives, and that it doesn't always have to be negative, because all we can see is like, this was a horrible thing that happened to me. I don't want to be influenced by it for the rest of my life. And so I'm going to work really hard to not be influenced by it. But then we set ourselves up for failure because we're not allowed to be changed by it. And now here we are trying to go back to the person we used to be, who doesn't know the things we know, who hasn't experienced the things we've experienced, and realizing, square peg, round hole. It's really, really hard. And oftentimes a product of our own thinking and influenced by other people, for sure. How many times will grieving people hear, well, when are you going to be back to normal? Or, when are you going to get over it? When are you going to return to your old self? When are you going to be more like who you used to be? All of those things reinforce the message that we're often already, listening to in our own brains about how we shouldn't be changed by trauma. The past needs to be the past. Don't let that, follow you around. All of those kind of messages really are damaging.
One of the things that I've experienced working with people particularly when it's in that vigiling, that final hour, and when they actually pass, the people that get to experience being in that room and being with them are very transformed by having that experience, and that they really are in some ways more authentic than they ever are in this magical moment that is transcending. And to see people that can have that experience and hold on to that experience and build on that experience, they actually become more authentic in their being, because they have this subtext now to who they are that they didn't have before. And it actually makes them less, not that they were shallow before, but it gives them depth, it gives them texture, it gives them, some character building aspects that are one of the benefits that I actually see often in death and dying.
Absolutely. And I think that perspective shift, if we allow it to influence the way we look at life, enhances our lives in every way. And it's, one of the things I love about working with widowed people is that you meet people at a time, and they don't have the energy to put on a mask. They are who they are. And that is all that they have the energy for. But the beautiful thing about peer support is that when people meet at that time and are able to share these deep experiences right out of the gate, because that's all that's on their mind, and that's all they have the energy for, they create bonds that last their lifetime. And those bonds begin, yes, with the grief and the pain and the trauma, but they shift into life experiences where, when I look at my own fish feeders, a good 60% of them are widowed people, because we have bonded over this experience that we've shared, and we have become for each other a life affirming force that, brings to bear both the perspective we've gained through our grief and our trauma, and also that flip side perspective, which is this really a big deal? Is this something that you need to put your energy into? Is that person who just said that to you really someone who you should allow into your head? Like, it just shifts the way the relationship builds. And it's a beautiful, powerful thing.
There is also, as I'm reading the book and I'm contemplating the changes that happened in me, and obviously the changes that happened in you through that experience, how that prepares me for the work that I do, certainly, but for another loss down the road that will happen, and I just know that I'm not the same person at all as I was then. I'm not the same person I was when my mother and father died, I will suffer loss again. So I love the idea of educating people to prepare for grief. How would you do that?
Well, and this is the thing. I think that there's only so much that you can prepare for, right? But what we can do is recognize that this grief experience is going to change you again. And because we have been changed and been able to recognize that and value that, as an example, when I was writing the book, my dad was dying. And because my husband had died in a very sudden way, within an hour, I was widowed. I'd never taken care of someone who was dying. And what I learned through my dad's death experience was that everything I learned while I was grieving Phil mattered when I was with my dad, and allowed me the courage to sit with him in ways that I'm not sure if I would have been, I hadn't done it. So I don't know how capable I would have been, but it wasn't even about capable so much as it was about confident. I knew that it was going to be horrible, and that it was going to hurt, and that it was going to be moments that I would never, ever, ever want to give back, that I would treasure this time. And so, knowing that meant that I could go into this caregiving, knowing these moments were going to be precious, and that they are limited, and that the pain was coming, and that the grief was coming. But I knew that I would always be grateful for having spent that time. And that was definitely true. I submitted the final copy of the manuscript from my parents' living room while I was on shift taking care of my dad. And so, that was just a really beautiful, as you said, reminder that we love people. We love, pets. We love things that have heartbeats that will eventually stop. And so we are not, as humans, ever really going to be in a place where we can't know that some grief is coming to us at some point. And I think what that has done for me personally is reminded me that every day matters. And as cliche as we sometimes feel that understanding is, when you use it and allow it to change the way you live your life, it has a significant impact on how you choose to spend your time, who you choose to spend your time with, where, how much you will allow your emotions to carry you away down a negative path. A lot of that shifts because you realize, we don't know how long we have. And living through that multiple times just reinforces the same message again. Live while you've got it, and make sure the people you know you care about them.
Absolutely. One of the things you also touched on in your book was that I related to, I hate to admit this, was, and I don't know that these were the words that you used, but it was about addiction to pain, and really hanging on to that pain as if it's some sort of mantle of honor or something that is just so, again, I think that's why the person that I hardly knew was just like able to see that in me,
Yeah. And the thing is that it's a really natural assumption that if we let go of the pain, then somehow we're letting go of the love. And I think that the work that we have to do as we grieve is to learn to separate the pain from the love and allow the pain to be released while maintaining the love. Because I really think that most people, when it comes to holding on to the pain, really are holding on to the fear that if they aren't in pain 24/7, then that means that they didn't love them that much, or that somehow someone around them is going to find out that they are not in pain today and assume that means that they're over it, God forbid. And so, that kind of thing is what drives us. But it's so comfortable. Pain becomes comfortable. It becomes your go-to, because if you hope for things, or if you look at your life and think, gosh, this might be getting better, you suddenly think, well, wait, what if it's not? I don't want to be disappointed again. Hold on, pain is safer. And so, pain can become our default as we fear what might replace the pain.
Well, and you were also talking about feeling that pain was one way to feel like you were alive.
Yes,
okay,
for sure.
If I'm in pain, at least I'm alive.
I'm feeling something. Yeah, because especially those early days, it's like you're numb. And that numbness, sometimes lasts as you're trying to figure yourself out, and you just suddenly shut down all your feelings. And so it's like, well, pain, first familiar, second culturally acceptable to a point until people decide you should be done. And then, thirdly, does feel like this visceral connection with your person. Because the pain is driven by the fact that you miss them.
So true. Oh, I just wish everybody could read your book, really, whether they're a widow or not. I just got so much out of it, and surprisingly things that I can use now, that's just.
So glad to hear that.
Yeah.
My hope was that it could be a book that anyone would benefit from, because we all live with trauma. And we all will grieve, and most people, even when they don't realize it, have grieved something already, not necessarily a person, but, a version of themselves, a number of things that we grieve. And the better able we are to understand grief and to welcome it as the tool that it is, then when we are in the midst of a big, deep, difficult loss, we have some tools to rely on, so that we're not just, out swimming in a sea that we have no direction in.
Yeah. And I loved that you talked about the people that were in your fishbowl were the widows that have surrounded you, so I think that's another thing that helps prepare people for grief that is expected or unexpected down the road, that you have that kind of quality of friendships, or family that you trust to, so many people don't have anyone. And I can't imagine how hard it is. Well, I can't imagine. I see it. It's hard.
Well, and the other piece of that too, for people who haven't experienced, a spousal or partner loss, is this idea that, in order to build your community, you have to be vulnerable. And that vulnerability is scary. And so I think what's natural about coming together in a widowed community is you've already decided, we both have this thing in common. So I encourage everyone, whatever that it is, the trauma they've lived through, to find other trauma survivors of that kind. Because when you do that, you have this basic level of understanding, and that makes the need to be vulnerable feel a little safer. Yeah. And allows you to make those meaningful connections. And so that, people, there was a person in my life at the time when I was writing who had experienced a break-in. She was home alone, and her home was broken into, and she was attacked. She was very fortunate that something happened to get her out of that situation, but she lived with the long-term fear and trauma of that experience. And so, for someone in that circumstance, being able to connect with other people who have had a similar experience helps to normalize the things you feel, helps to normalize your fears and anxieties, and also confirms that you're not the only one. Because so often we can be in this spot where we feel, when I was widowed, I felt like the only widow in the world. I knew that was impossible. And, it didn't make any logical sense, whatever. Yeah. But I felt like I was the only widowed person in the world. And so for each of us as trauma survivors, finding like-minded or like experienced people who often aren't like-minded necessarily, which is a good point to make. You might have only this one big thing in common, but it's enough to begin to build a safe relationship that can really positively influence you going forward. Yeah. Even though many times people would be like, but why are you hanging out with widows? Aren't they sad? And I'm like, you have no idea how much fun we have, and how, in part because we do have that deep connection. Of course we do cry. Of course we talk about the traumatic things still to this day. I've been widowed for 16 years. There are still things that can bring that right to the surface. And I have a whole cadre of people that I can reach out to at any moment to say, this is still sucks. This part of it, I still don't like. And here's why. And it takes less time now because, the depth of the experience has shifted, but I will never unknow what I know. And because of that, I'll always need the support of other people who know that same thing.
And you're still experiencing this, and you're in a new marriage with an Australian. Okay. Yes. I've got to bite.
I don't know how we could have more in common, Claire.
I've got to bite though, because this has just made me laugh out loud when you said don't ask. Okay, what about the fruitcake? You said don't ask. And I mean, I laughed because Terry and I have our own joke about fruitcake. So I've got to hear the fruitcake story. It's
so funny because when Michael first came to America for his first visit, he said something about fruitcake. And I was like, fruitcake? That's what you give people you don't like. And he said,
that's exactly what I said.
He said, oh my gosh, I hope none of your friends like me. Does that mean they're all going to give me fruitcake? And so then when we got married, we were talking about the wedding cake, and never in a million years occurred to this American girl that anybody would make a wedding cake out of fruitcake. And he was like, well, of course it's going to be fruitcake. I was like, what? I said, no one will eat that. So we did have fruitcake as well at our wedding. And actually we had a number of Australians, and they all delighted over the fruitcake, but the Americans were all like, what is that?
Same. I mean, I had to explain to Terry, I said, you don't understand. Old people give fruit cakes for Christmas. Right. And you have it around for like a year, and you re-gift it. It's just like nobody wants fruitcake. Well, everybody loves it here. I have a Lions Club fruitcake in my pantry right now.
I was going to say, he will bring home in his suitcase, make room for the pounds, because these are dense cakes. He will have to make room to make sure that he has enough space left in his allotment for his weight requirement to get a fruitcake in. And then what always blows my mind is that you eat off of that cake, which is not refrigerated, for a year. Like, and he's still cutting a piece and enjoying the heck out of it. So I have not yet learned to appreciate fruitcake for myself.
I don't think we have to.
I don't intend to make it a goal.
I know. So, And I wanted to also find out about the organization in Kerrville, Texas, another thing we have in common, but
Really?
well, I was born in Texas. I mean, I did
Right.
all my working adult years in California, but yeah, my whole.
Yeah. So when the thing about being widowed, especially for younger widowed people, is that there just isn't a lot of research, almost no research about the widowed experience from a younger person's perspective. A lot of the US, especially, research is done on older populations, and there is a value in that, but there's a shift in as you move through life experiences, right? So for people who were raising kids, for people who didn't have a chance to have kids because their person died too soon, all of these things sort of influence the way that we consider what it means to have moved through our widowed experience and rebuilt our life. And so when I realized early on, I was helping someone, another widow. She was doing her thesis about life satisfaction for widowed people, and she needed to poll people in order to do that. So she asked if she could come to Camp Widow. So through a few iterations of back and forth, we decided to do it. And my whole point was just to help her get her doctorate.
Mm-hmm.
But what I realized after was how powerful it was to be able to ask some questions of widowed people about how they would define their life satisfaction, about what resilience looked like. And so typically the resilience scales include impossible questions to answer. Like if you were to look at this scale and it's asking the survey question, I seek to replace all the losses in my life. And that's to put the expected answer as, yes, of course I do. Well, how can you say that about a person? And so I kept reading these various questions and saying to our researcher team, like, no one's going to answer yes to that. Like no widowed person is going to look at this and think, oh, that's a definition of resilience that I would like to adopt. And so what developed eventually was this beautiful partnership with Schreiner University, which is in Kerrville, Texas. Mm-hmm. We have the Soaring Spirits Resilience Center has a spot on campus there. And what our work is to continue to do research about resilience in widowed people specifically, what fosters resilience, what tools and resources should be available, and how can we shape them to be practically useful for people to build resilience through the widowed experience. Our first published paper was actually published on 9/11 in 2019, and it is called the Widowed Resilience Scale. And what we did was we asked widowed people to define resilience for themselves. We paired that with the current research related to what we know about resilience in all situations, and we came together with a scale where people can take this survey, and the survey will help them identify where should they put their energy to best access the building of resilience. And that's available for free, actually, on the Soaring Spirits website. If you go to the Resilience Center, it will take you to the survey, so you can take the survey. The survey results are delivered by email, and it says things like, instead of asking someone to replace all the losses in their life, we say things like, I can laugh every day. And even if your answer is no, I cannot laugh every day, you can see why you might want to. Yeah. And so it sets up a definition that encourages you to view resilience in sort of a holistic way that does not require you to give things up in order to be able to adopt.
I'm gonna look at that, and we will put the link to all of this, in YouTube and all awesome. Where we post it. God, we've really gotten into our time. I am so happy to meet you. I mean, I just love the work that you're doing, and I was so impressed again to see you as a CNN hero and all the bling and how beautiful you look. You look beautiful now, but you really look beautiful.
Thank you very much.
Tell everyone again the name of your book and how they can get it, and how if they wanted to reach out to you, what's the best way to get hold of you, and yeah.
So Different After You, Rediscovering Yourself and Healing After Grief and Trauma is my book. It is available through all of the booksellers. In Australia, it'd also be available on Amazon. I think it's still waiting to update right now, but so you can buy it on Amazon. You can buy it in the US on Barnes and Noble. There's indie bookstores that are selling it. So if you put different after you and Michele Neff Hernandez, you'll easily find an option for buying the book, as well as you can find me on my website, which is michelleneffhernandez.com. And the book links for purchase are there as well as being able to connect back to the organization. The organization is Soaring Spirits International, and we do a full complement of virtual and in-person programs designed particularly for people who have experienced the death of a spouse or partner. As we talked about earlier, our definition of widowed is very broad, and so you can access all of our programs through the Soaring Spirits website. It takes you to all the various websites that are linked together in order to provide.
So it's not just for people in California, it's for people everywhere.
We serve in 153 countries in the world. And I'm excited to share for anyone listening from Australia that we will have a Camp Widow, which is one of our key programs. It's a weekend-long event that offers resources, workshops, community, social events, for widowed people, and it will be held in Brisbane in August of 2022. And you will be able to find information for that on the Soaring Spirits website as well. So there's a lot there, but there is also information for people who are not widowed but are supporting someone who's widowed. So we try to provide a whole sort of full circle network of support around widowed people so that they have the best chance possible to feel like they have access to a supportive community, as well as tools that were developed specifically for this life experience.
It's just such important work. And, because where I work in this realm is before the fact, I generally, don't see people that much after the fact. And I've really learned so much from people like yourself, how important that time is. And that there is support out there. There is support out there. So there
is support, and that we benefit so greatly when we access it, because I think we've been trained sort of to fend our way on our own. And even though, the human experience is to be connected. And so it's important during times of pain and trauma to be sure that you have the best community you can find around you. And sometimes we have to create it and go out looking for it. But once you've found it, it really does make such a difference to your ability to make your way through anything that's painful.
It will make or break the rest of your life, that time. So that's really so important. Well, thank you, Michele. I hope we'll talk again soon. And good luck with the book.
Thank you so much.